Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Amitabh Mattoo, one of India's best-known strategic analysts, professor at JNU as well as at Melbourne University, and Dhruva Jaishankar, director of US initiatives at the Observer Research Foundation in Washington, D.C. We're connecting the time zones today. Dr. Mattoo is in Srinagar, India, and Dhruva is in Washington, D.C. Welcome, both of you, to the Print Debates.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are discussing the visit of US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as the US Defense Secretary Mark Esper. The 2+2 dialogue between India and the US on the foreign ministers and defense ministers front has just concluded. 2 days of talks. Both of you gentlemen have probably heard the statements that all four politicians have just made. Lots of very interesting things that have happened just 1 week before the US presidential election. Most importantly, in India, at the 2+2 dialogue, the BECA defense agreement, or the Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement, has been signed. A bit of a mouthful for me, but your first comments, Dr. Mattoo, you go first. What do you think of the 2+2 dialogue that's just taken?
I think by all accounts, it seems to have gone spectacularly well in terms of signing BECA, in terms of the chemistry, and a sense of urgency that's been communicated. I think Mike Pompeo didn't mince words in Tokyo. He didn't mince words in Delhi when he talked about the Chinese threat. And from where I am sitting in Srinagar, geographically speaking at least, that threat is obvious. And BECA is really, in some ways, builds this relationship on a different level of trust.
So what's the threat? Is it China? Is the threat China? Is the common threat China?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's no doubt about it that there is a feeling in Washington and clearly signs of that clear and present danger being felt in Delhi and in parts of India, especially after the episodes of Galwan. And it's been, 150 days since Galwan, or 140 days since Galwan. And the fact is that they have occupied Indian territory, but even their behavior otherwise, Xi Jinping's attitude, of course, in terms of the pandemic, Washington and President Trump and Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo, being clearer. They're described as the Wuhan created pandemic, and how China has been grossly irresponsible. I think India has been less than explicit on that front. But whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the pugnacious attitude of the Chinese, I think both Indians and the United States have that sense. Mm-hmm. For a long time, since the 60s, they've never had this real convergence on seeing the China threat so in exactly the same terms as Dhruva. Right.
Dhruva Jaishankar, you're in Washington, D.C., both Mike Pompeo and Mark Esper making this long transatlantic journey to Delhi exactly 1 week before the presidential poll. I mean, the polls say today, well, at least today, 1 week before the election, that Donald Trump is losing the presidential election. So why were Pompeo and Esper so keen to come?
I mean, I think two things. One, I don't think we should read too much into the timing of this. This has been in the works in some ways since last December. And it just so happens that, the scheduling played out the way it did. But that being said, I think there was a keenness on the part of the US government to hold another 2+2 with India before November 3rd. And it's really come down to the wire.
But why?
And that's...
But I think it's significant. If 1 week's time, everything is going to change. So
the important thing today is that India is one of the few growing relationships for the United States today, and one that enjoys broadly bipartisan consensus. And so, I think that it's really about consolidating the gains of the last few years at this point in time. So there was a keenness to hold one Quad meeting and one 2+2 before November 3rd, and it just so happened partly because of the coronavirus pandemic that it really came down to just a few weeks before the election.
Amitabh, what do you think? Why do you think Pompeo and Esper were so keen to come? Do you think this has something to do with influencing the Indian American vote in the presidential election?
I don't think so. I don't think you should read it tactically from that point of view. I think it's got to do, as Dhruva said, perhaps with scheduling dates as well. But I think more importantly, I would like to read it in a bipartisan terms, that even though there might be differences of nuance, were President Trump to lose and President Biden to take over, there's of course that transition period till January, but there is a bipartisan commitment to India and a concern about China. Now, as I have argued that Biden maybe slightly softer and more predictable on China than Trump has, but in terms of the relationship with India, I think there is clear agreement. So this long dash from across the Atlantic into India is not in many ways just a tactical way to score points or get more support from Indian Americans for the Trump campaign. I think it's to do with the fact that everyone, both sides of the divide, understand the importance of India and want to now move ahead, irrespective of what happens in the elections.
What do you think, Dhruva? Is it because of the Indian American community, a very small community, but an influential one? So do you think this reaching out, this embracing right now, even at this sort of dead heat, will that make a difference to Trump's election?
I don't think so. And I don't think that's also the calculation behind it. The two officials are the secretaries of state and defense, which are political appointees, but don't, it's not like the president or the vice president who are actively campaigning at this very moment. So I won't read too much into that. I think, the two polls have come out in the last few weeks on Indian Americans. Both seem to suggest that they'll remain very solidly Democratic. We don't know how, because we don't have the similar polling data from 4 years ago. We don't know how much of a swing there's been, but if there has been one, it has been quite marginal.
So that's my next question to you, Dhruva, that if despite Namaste Trump, this big trip by Trump to Ahmedabad earlier this year before COVID and last year's Howdy Moody event in Houston, Texas, despite that, Indian Americans are staying close to the Democratic community.
Yes. No, I don't think that's a surprise. That's very much a surprise. I mean, again, what little polling data we have from 2016 suggests that Indian Americans may have been the ethnic group in the US that voted most favorably for Hillary Clinton, the Democratic candidate 4 years ago. President Trump has made an outreach efforts with the Indian American community, with India as well. But I think it may have been offset by other things. For example, adverse immigration policies, adverse social policies, and the sense that the Republican Party remains dominated by white voters, is hostile to new immigrants. So some of those things may have offset any potential gains that Trump and the Republican Party may have made with Indian American voters. So I'm not too surprised by the lack of movement. But that being said, I don't think we know, because again, we don't have really good data, consistent data from 4 years ago. We don't really know how much of a swing. Best guess is it's somewhere in the range of about 5% may have reconsidered their vote.
So Amitabh, in your view, do you think that the Indian American community, if, as Dhruva says, and if you see the polls, is so far committed to the Democratic candidates? Now, in a Biden administration, how do you think things will change, or you don't think they will change?
First of all, I think in terms of anecdotal data or less than firmly argued, rigorous scientific data, this is a movement away from the Democrats. If the 73% of Indian Americans voted, as some polls have indicated, for Hillary in the last election, there's about 62% now in supportive for Biden. So there seems to have been a shift. Of course, the Kamala Harris factor has played a role as well in terms of bolstering support for Biden and Harris. Having said that, I think in the swing states, there should be, at least again anecdotally, in states like Texas, Philadelphia, Michigan, there seems to be a slightly bigger swing towards the Republicans than is indicated in some of the newer polls, which haven't disaggregated the data as much as we would have expected. But having said that, I think given if Biden were to win, and given that overwhelming sections, at least a majority of the Indian Americans have voted for them, logically speaking, the Biden relationship with Delhi, and given Kamala Harris's own cultural background, would mean that there is even a stronger relationship in the offing. Whether that will translate into a more offensive relationship, offensive within inverted comma, vis-a-vis China, remains to be seen. But so you might have a much more cautious, predictable relationship with China, not given to the kind of unpredictable, often eccentric behavior of the President Trump himself.
Right.
But I think in the long term, both parties recognize that the greatest strategic threat to the United States is from the People's Republic of China.
What do you think, Dhruva? Do you think that a potential Biden administration will still consider China as the threat that Amitabh is so clear about?
Broadly, I would agree with Professor Mattoo's assessment on that, which is, I think that there is, to some degree, a bipartisan consensus, and more than that, it's infiltrated the bureaucracy, to some extent, sectors of the business community, that there is this systemic challenge from China for the United States. So that, in some ways, the context is very different from 2009 when President Obama took office, or even 2015, 2016 when he left office. I think there is a clear realization on the part of Democrats. I think there is not yet a consensus on what to do about it and how much to cooperate, on what areas potential cooperation can lie, climate change, trade. Is there room for cooperation with China on these areas? Does that mean dialing back some of the more aggressive moves of the Trump administration in certain areas, for example, starting with tariffs, for example, imposed on China? Right. So on that, there is still, I think, considerable debate within the Democratic Party and within the people around Biden advising him on foreign policy and national security. And we'll have to see how that plays out, which will have implications for India as well.
Jyoti, if I may just add there that, in some ways there has obviously been differences between, say, state and treasury. As a friend of mine who's a political economist said, in many ways, the Frankenstein's monster that China is today is a creation of American capitalism. So that explains a lot, but also in the fact that American capital has invested a great deal in China. And while it may on paper seem easy to make supply chains or to at least have a more robust supply chain outside China, it's not easy. It's not going to be easy to disconnect the economic relationship with China as it seems to be during this pandemic, where everyone is reacting impulsively. Right. But it's going to take at least the course of the first 4 years of the Biden administration to make the United States less dependent on China.
But Amitabh, let me ask you, you're sitting in Srinagar, and it's been just over a year, about 15 months since Article 370 was revoked. And that actually was the Indian government's or the Modi government's decision was received not without, let me say this again, that since the revocation of Article 370 by the Modi government, the US government or Trump's administration did not criticize it as much as some people would have expected it to. Now, do you think that issues like human rights will come up early on in the Biden administration, and that may affect the India-US relationship, especially vis-a-vis Kashmir?
I mean, historically speaking, and even in terms of representation of congressmen and women within the Democratic Party, clearly there is greater, some might say sensitivity, others might say bully-headedness about liberal concerns like human rights, gender, religious freedoms, democracy. So that will be a factor. But I think to assume that the relationship as far as Biden and Harris go with New Delhi will be determined by that, with that factor is overstating it. There will be people who dissenting voices. There will be voices, perhaps speaking out more aggressively, perhaps writing more articles in the New York
like
Times.
Nepal type of person who would be more
exactly, perhaps having more congressional hearings on issues like religious freedom or on Kashmir. You should expect that, and you should perhaps prepare for that. But I think this whole idea that Biden-Harris regime is going to spell a Cassandra-like disaster for the India-US relationship is plainly false, because I think what both of them bring to bear is, as Dhruva pointed out, is the support of the Indian Americans and a firm long-term commitment towards India, towards Indian democracy. I mean, the last time that a Democratic president acted poorly towards India was in the first term of perhaps the first few years of the Clinton administration.
After the nuclear tests,
no, before you had Robin Raphael, who,
of course, 1992.
Who questioned the accession of Jammu and Kashmir, and at that time Kashmir was flaring, and you had her as a political counselor in the American embassy, and who never got beyond Hardeep Singh Puri during her tenure as assistant secretary.
At the time, Hardeep Singh Puri, who's now a minister in the Modi government, was at the time a diplomat, and he was responsible for the America's desk in the Ministry of External Affairs.
Yeah, as joint secretary of the America's desk, and now I think, and deservedly so, because she was acting very imperial. Because she thought she was a friend of Bill and she was going to be soon elevated, so she should have an audience with the Prime Minister, who in that case was Narasimha Rao, and I did think she finally managed an audience with him. But she had this baggage of having a deep relationship with the Pakistanis, which became clearer later when she became a lobbyist for the Pakistanis, or as well as with Kashmiri separatists.
Right. So, Dhruva, we're all behaving as if India is going to be on top of Biden's agenda. I mean, I don't know whether that's going to be true or not. I certainly hope so. But let me ask you, this China threat that we keep talking about, or the common China threat that Amitabh just spoke about. Now, China is sitting on Indian territory in Ladakh. I mean, let's face it, what are the Americans going to do, or how does the US help India with, facing this China threat?
No, I mean, so first of all, on the priorities, I think, if we were to assume that the Biden administration does win, Biden does win, and it's not a foregone conclusion by any means, I think there'll be a number of other issues on the agenda, and India specifically may not be, for the first 6 months, very high on that agenda, just because of the competing pressures of various things, China, Russia, Europe. I mean, just on the foreign policy front, but of course the domestic agenda will be quite strong. So I expect we'll see a quiet first 6 months and by the way, that will possibly happen even if Trump is reelected, because there will be some change in personnel and so forth as well. So I don't think India in that sense will be a high priority, but I think by the end of the year, when you have the usual, major summits in Asia and such, we should have the contours of an Asia agenda of the new administration in place. And I think that would be really the time to see how much the India relationship can be taken forward in any meaningful way. Now, in terms of what it means, on
the China threat.
I don't think there's if you look at it, there is a larger challenge that the United States is facing of a very assertive China globally. And in some cases, in the Western Pacific, bumping up directly against a U.S. security presence there, whether it's in South Korea, Japan, Guam, Taiwan, and so forth. What exactly does the partnership do for India? I think a few things. One, we've seen particularly important cooperation in the maritime domain. And that is likely to continue.
Ladakh, there's a territorial, aggression.
I think Ladakh,
India got to do with the maritime domain. I mean, I know they keep talking about a free and open Indo-Pacific, but really, and all that's very well. The Quad is great. You have sort of, from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. That's all really well. But
I think you underestimate perhaps the ability of the Indian government to take care of its own security issues. And this is, I think, what has been happening for the last 6 months. And I think any
point is that everybody
is being undermined. Yeah. Any sense that India needs to rely upon others for that. Beyond, I think, we have seen some very meaningful cooperation, for example, in the intelligence realm. I don't know about the specifics this time around, but certainly during Doklam, there was a great deal of cooperation between India and the US that was unprecedented, really. So look, I expect we will see
like what? What kind of cooperation happened during?
I'm not during Doklam. I think there was a degree of intelligence sharing that I think we'd not seen in the past previously between India and the United States when it came to China. So again,
if you want to be a little bit more specific than that, because
I honestly don't know the specifics of it, but I'll give you, for example, a few other things. If you look at the key equipment that India now deploys in its territorial disputes, a lot of it, not all of it, of course, but a lot of it really is sourced from the United States. C-17, C-130Js that are high, that provide high altitude capabilities, lightweight artillery, which India now deploys. So there are many ways in which the India-US security relationship, bilateral security relationship, is assisting India in defending its own territorial integrity today.
Right.
And
so,
that,
yeah. No, so Amitabh, the same question to you. I mean, Menuki, right? If America's, after all, you're paying good money for the arms that you're buying from the Americans, similarly with the Russians. Okay, you have an old historical defense relationship with Russia, and that's a separate issue. And you certainly want to diversify, which is a great thing. But how are the Americans going to help you confront your threat in Ladakh? That you have to do yourself, right?
I think, Jyoti, what is the question that you really want to ask is what's the cost of all this that we are doing with the United States in terms of our strategy and in terms of our political relationship and in terms of our own identity and decision making. Now, are we in some ways becoming a junior partner to the United States? Are we losing our ability to make independent decisions?
Are we?
On issues on war and peace? I think the jury is still out, but I don't think so.
No, but Pompeo keeps saying, look, Pompeo and the Indian External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, have met twice in the last 2 weeks. He keeps saying China, China, China. He talks about China in India. He talked about China in Tokyo.
That's independent. Jyoti, that independently you arrive at your own national assessment that China is a threat. That China is a threat to India is something that I've been arguing, or others have been arguing. For
but the question about
are you compromising on your decision making? Is the United States? Are you going to fight America's war against China? No, at the moment, certainly not compromising on your independence of decision making.
Okay.
And so that autonomy remains. If it loses, then you're losing out on that capacity to independently make decisions and determine for yourself whether this is an issue of war or peace in India's national interest.
No, but the question is that, to you, Dhruva, the Quad, what is the Quad? It's Australia, Japan, India, and the US. Now, that is an alliance, whether you want to call it a partnership, an alliance, a friendship. I don't know. There's
I think the words matter. The words matter.
The same thing.
No, the words matter because I think the problem with an alliance is it connotes something that it is not, which is that it connotes something equivalent to a mutual defense treaty or something, which is not something that India is signing, nor is there any interest, by the way, on the part of the United States or any of the other Quad countries to sign such an agreement with India today. And I think that everyone is realistic about that possibility. So, for that reason, I don't think we should think of it as an alliance or even an emerging alliance. But that being said, I think there's a great deal that can be done in at least on the security side in 3 areas. One is increased military interoperability. And again, this is most advanced in the maritime domain, but I think we're seeing elements of it.
What does that mean, though? If you can just make it,
It means it's the 2 militaries working together more seamlessly. Mm-hmm. And that's what secure communications, sharing geospatial information as
that's what the Becca Pact is about.
Yes, logistics agreements that India has now signed with Japan and Australia and the United States. So basically, it's more allowing the militaries to work more seamlessly together in a variety.
All these 4 militaries in these Quad nations, Australia, Japan, India, and the US, and their navies will be able to talk to each other and exchange information, etc.
Yes, and resupply each other more seamlessly and so forth. So I think that's one area. A second is capacity building. So helping each other, and here in the India-US relationship, I think is perhaps the most important, which is it's really about helping, over the long term, prepare each other's militaries and then make sure that they're more capable. And a third area is information sharing, whether it is tactical intelligence, sometimes in real time, we're having that happen now. 2 strategic assessments, which is what in some ways the conversations at the Quad meetings and 2+2 are about.
Right. The same question to you, which is, if India is not in an alliance, is an alliance such a bad idea? How does it matter whether...
An alliance is an alliance like a NATO is a mutual defense treaty, which means, or Australia, for instance, has fought every war since the Boer War, in which it had no real interest. There was no real national interest. We don't want to be in that position. The Indian nation will not allow you to be in that position where you're going to fight other people's wars. No. But if you arrive at a concord, an understanding, an agreement, a relationship, a quad, by which you can together work towards a common threat, there's nothing wrong with it. Secondly, for instance, Becca, at least the promise of Becca, is that you will be able to access geospatial intelligence, and at least some of the promises that are revealed by the media, open source media, is that potentially you could get locations of the PLA formation, troop movements, incursions, etc. Now the other side, and I read a completely bizarre article which suggests that gives the Americans the capability to snoop and intercede and perhaps even destroy your communications network. Now, it's important to take a measured view of all this. Becca is something which I think is important given the circumstances that obtain on the border. America is not, we don't want Americans to come and fight a war with China or fight whatever confrontation that we have with China. Americans, as Dhruva says, are not interested. They're moving out. Certainly not with Trump. They're not going to come out. They want the Europeans to pay for their own defense. So they're not in the mood nationally, or certainly not within the Republican Party. So that sense of deep fear and anxiety, which in some ways is born out of 200 years of colonialism, I think we have to shed. However, I, for one, believe that we still need to maintain a sense of strategic autonomy, which is not a red flag. It seems to have arrived as a red flag that strategic autonomy is in some ways against a closer relationship or cohabitation in the military space with countries like the United States. No, it just says that you have the right ultimately to say no when you don't want to enter into a war or a conflict at any time in the future. That's all.
Yeah. Dhruva, Jaishankar, the last question to you. In these last 4 years of the Trump administration, which have coincided with Prime Minister Modi's terms in power, or the last 6 years of his term in power, now the India-US relationship has grown beyond belief. Do you think that this is a good thing, and do you think it will survive?
I think that there are certain structural factors that have brought India and the US together, China being one of them, and shared concerns about China being one of them. The sort of economic and people-to-people links being another very strong glue that has brought the two countries together. A certain broad sense of values. So I think.
But can I just interrupt you in the sense? I'm sorry to interrupt you in the sense of values, but apart from Kashmir, and we talk about human rights, we almost exclusively refer to Kashmir. But actually, you've had under the Modi government a lot of other human rights violations, especially relating to Muslims in India. But that hasn't been significantly, again, red flagged by the Trump administration. Do you think that could change?
No, look, I think we need to have a more robust conversation between India and the United States on issues of democracy, and not just in each other's countries, but also globally. Today we're at a stage, India and the US are both proud pluralistic democracies, but we have very, in some ways different attitudes to a lot of things, from freedom of expression. And I remember, by the way, this being an issue 10 years ago when there were different governments in place. So I think, one of the things that Biden has promised as president is to have a global summit of democracies. Now, it's currently at a very vague state, but this is something India should actually be engaging a potential Biden administration on. Let's see what happens after November 3rd. This is actually an area where I think India should be very proactively engaging them, and a more robust and as Biden put it, an honest conversation is perhaps in order today.
Right. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for participating in the print debates. Amitabh, Mattoo in Srinagar, Dhruva, Jaishankar in Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time. And please subscribe to the Print's YouTube channel and tell us what you think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.